Okay, so today we are going to talk about some of the arguments that have been made. There's been more arguments made against belief in God of any kind, as well as in certain Christian doctrines, such as the Trinity, which nobody can make sense of. What I did is I wrote up an essay on two of the primary arguments that have been offered. Now, these are, even though they're the books that have been published where these arguments were presented were published recently in the sense of in the 2000s, like 2006, 2007. So it's a while ago, but it's not ancient history. But the arguments are old. They've been around for a long time. They just don't go away. They just keep getting new adherents who try to make the same arguments, maybe using different points of view. In the early 2000s, a group of people published a bunch of books. And there was enough of them, most of them were British, by the way. They were referred to as the New Atheists. The most famous one is Richard Dawkins. He is an evolutionary biologist from, I'm sure he lives in London, or maybe Oxford. I don't know if he's still teaching or not. But anyway, he wrote a book called The God Delusion that got widespread publicity. And, of course, got him invitations onto numerous shows. How many of you listen to podcasts? Any of you listen to podcasts? No. There's thousands of them. People who are trying to make a living talking about things. You can get a podcast out of any subject you want. But anyway, they get invited onto podcasts. So many of these arguments got a lot more publicity recently than they had in the past. However, I did put in a little bit about my own experience when I went to West Valley Community College in Saratoga from 1974 to 76. Virtually every one of my professors who were in the area of the humanities, the science professors, the math professors didn't talk about this. But if it was a psychologist or a sociologist or an American Lit professor, something like that, they were all militantly anti-God. Okay, so the two arguments I'm going to deal with is the argument from suffering and an argument that is based on the idea that God is a delusion. We're going to start with the argument from suffering. Now, there's two possible reasons that people think the argument that human beings suffer in this world is evidence against the existence of God. Okay, there's two possible reasons. One is intellectual. They find it self-contradictory to believe that a good God would create a world where things like as bad as the Holocaust would happen. And there's merit to that. It's hard to figure it out. It really is. Okay, so there's the ones that have the intellectual problem with it. But then, of course, as a pastor, I've had to deal more often, not with people who have intellectual problems, with belief in God and acknowledging the suffering of humanity, but people who recently went through a terrible loss. They're feeling pain, and they don't know why God would allow this to happen to them. Okay? So you have to address the two arguments differently. The second group, who are in grief, are not looking for a logical argument. They're looking for a source of comfort and hope. That's what they're looking for. The first group, logical work, okay, because it's just an intellectual exercise, okay? All right, so let's start with that one. Belief in God is not possible in a world where human suffering is so overwhelming and pervasive around the world. There are two forms of human suffering. The first I'm going to deal with is that which is caused by natural disasters. Okay? Let's think about natural disasters for a minute. The first thing I want to point out is that how many of you have ever heard the phrase cosmological constants? No?
I've heard it, but I forget the context.
Okay. There are certain well, they're called cosmological constants because they're measured using mathematical formulas. All right. Take the force of gravity. If the force of gravity was changed even the slightest, tiniest little bit, something like 10 to the 40th power, the universe would not be able to exist. It would either crash in on itself, or the gravity wouldn't be strong enough to hold it together and it would disperse. What holds the galaxies and the stars together is gravity. And that's what holds the Earth to the sun, right? If the power of gravity changed even slightly, the universe would fall apart. Okay, that's a cosmological constant. There's also cosmological constants with subatomic particles. That's harder for me to explain because I don't know enough about it, but I have read about it. Okay? If those were changed, again, just even slightly, life would not be possible. Okay, so the first answer to the question about natural disasters is to point out that for life to be possible on this planet, things have to be fine-tuned to such a degree that it would be like walking along the beach, finding a beautiful watch, and believing that that watch just came together by accident. Would anybody believe that? Okay, this is the argument from intelligent design. All right. Okay, so the first approach is to point out that it's more likely based on scientific evidence, it's more likely that the universe has an intelligent designer than that it just popped into existence out of nothing. All right? And we know it had a beginning. Okay, that's been proven already. People used to believe that the universe was eternal. It was always here. When they figured out that there was a Big Bang, the evidence was obvious, and they had to give up the theory that it's always been here. That's when some people began to ask the question about intelligent design. There is an organization, in my former church, a member of this organization belonged to my former church, called the Discovery Institute. They do research in intelligent design. Okay? And argue rather, they argue convincingly for an intelligent designer. Okay. Now, that does not, however, address the issue of earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes. Those are the common natural disasters, right? Those are the most common. However, for life to be possible on this planet, certain conditions have to be met. Okay? Let's take, for example, hurricanes and tornadoes first. Hurricanes and tornadoes are mostly seasonal. With global warming, it's a little off now, but hurricanes happen when? Summer and fall. That's when Florida or Louisiana get hit, right?
Connecticut.
You know, even up further up the East Coast, yeah. Okay, so they inevitably come across from Africa, is where they form. They gain strength in the warm water, and then hopefully they go off, but sometimes they don't. Okay. Tornadoes, when do they happen? Mostly. Spring. Sometimes in the summer, but the spring is the most often, and it's the Midwest is tornado alley in the whole world, because the seasons are changing. Why are the seasons changing? The seasons are changing because the Earth, as it revolves around the sun, in the summertime, the Earth is tilted, the northern part of the Earth, the northern hemisphere, is tilted toward the sun, so it's warm. In the winter, the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun, so it gets colder. Okay? In the spring, it's changing. All right, so you're getting warm air coming up from the south, and you're getting cold air coming down from the north. And when it hits, it causes thunderstorms and tornadoes. All right? But if things were different, if we didn't have that jet stream that causes the air to go up and down the way it does, or if the Earth didn't tilt so that there weren't seasons, what would happen to life on Earth?
We didn't have seasons. It probably couldn't exist.
It couldn't exist. It couldn't exist. Right? It isn't possible to come up with a scenario of a world that can support life and at the same time does not have the conditions that occasionally are going to cause a tornado, a hurricane, or an earthquake. It's not possible. to design a planet that can do that and still support life. All right? Earthquakes, where do they come from?
Faults.
Fault lines. Okay, the earth consists of tectonics, plates, right? Okay, and they come together. And over time, there's pressure because they're constantly moving. So the pressure builds up. So at a certain point, in order to release the pressure, they have to move. It's just, it's not possible to have a planet that has oceans and dry land without also having these tectonic plates. You have to have them. Okay, so there again, there's no scenario whereby you can create a planet that can support life that doesn't have earthquakes. It's inevitable. Have any of you looked at diagrams of what the earth looked like millions of years ago, where the continents were and how things were shaped? Yeah. You can see when you look carefully at, is it Africa? I think, I don't remember exactly, but if you look at the shape of Africa and the shape of North America, the two used to be one. At one time they were one.
You mean South America,
Yeah, most of the stuff.
Maybe South America, yeah.
I mean, all of them were one.
Yeah. But anyway, you can see how they had fit together.
Yeah.
You can see it, yeah. Okay, so that's why they're called natural disasters. They're natural. They're natural because God created the natural world in order that it could sustain life. And in order to do that, God created it the way it is, and the way it is necessarily makes for the possibility of earthquakes, tornadoes, and hurricanes. It's not that God wanted people to suffer hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes. It's that you would have to have a perfect world for that to be. And coincidentally, that's precisely what Christianity predicts will one day happen. Creation will be redeemed, and it will become perfect. Okay, so the argument that natural disasters is somehow or another contradictory to the existence of God just doesn't work, because it's actually the opposite. If there weren't natural disasters, there wouldn't be possibility of life. So it's exactly the opposite. Okay. Now, how about if you're talking to someone who's in pain? Okay. Just for the sake of making it simple, we'll talk about somebody who just lost their life partner. They're in deep grief. Okay. When I fell the other day, Kirsten has been reminding me every day, I can't lose you. You watch what you're doing. Anyway, okay. There is also suffering caused by human beings. Okay, that's not natural disasters. That's humanly caused suffering. Okay, 20th century alone, we had the Soviet Union. 20 million people died under Stalin. We had Hitler, who knows how many people died under him. We had Mao Zedong, at least 20 million perished under his rule. It was an absolute mess, the 20th century. However, I know more about the Civil War, so I'm going to use that as an example, okay? All right. Why did there have to be a Civil War? Now, the Civil War is actually a good example because there were over 1 million casualties during the Civil War. 600,000 dead, and some over 400,000 lost limbs or were maimed in some way. Okay? That was something like a high percentage of the population. Yeah. Because America wasn't that populated back then. Okay?
But they still couldn't get along.
Okay, well, here's the reason. The underlying reason for the Civil War was not the fight over slavery that was taking place in the decade prior to the Civil War. The foundational problem was that America was founded on 2 documents. One was the Declaration of Independence, which said all people are created equal. And then we formed a constitution, and in order to keep the slave states in the Union, we agreed to call black people 3/5 of a person. You cannot have a country that on the one hand says all people are created equal, and on the other hand says a certain portion of the population is worth only 3/5 of a person. It isn't possible. And the founders knew it. They knew it. Jefferson predicted a war. Washington tried to do something to avoid it by freeing his slaves. You know, they knew this was a time bomb, okay? God did not create that time bomb. People did. We did that. The Civil War was a war that absolutely had to take place for this to become a country, because of the way it was founded. So the idea that humanly caused suffering is an argument against the existence of God doesn't work, because number one, God doesn't cause the human suffering, humans do. And number two, Christianity actually directly addresses this issue. According to the Christian faith, human beings have fallen from their Creator. They don't have a proper relationship with a Creator who commanded them to love one another, not to shoot one another. Let me use this metaphor. Suppose you were in you wandered into a cave, okay, and it had a bunch of different, ways you could go. And suppose you got lost in that cave, and you couldn't find your way out. What would you need at that time in order to save yourself?
Divine inspiration. I don't know where you're going with this.
You would need somebody to come into the cave to find you and lead you out again. And that is the purpose of the birth of Jesus Christ. He was born a human being to lead us out of our bondage to false ideas about who we are, who God is, and who other people are, and to lead us to the truth. To save us from ourselves. Okay? So, to me, the suffering caused by human beings is actually evidence of the truth of Christianity, because number one, Christianity diagnoses humanity as being fallen and sinful. And number two, Christianity proposes a solution that works. God sends His Son, who knows how to lead us out of the darkness back into the light. And what do we have to do to deserve that? You just have to receive Christ, that's all. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to make yourself righteous. That's the Santa Claus version of God. Don't be naughty, be nice, and then you'll get a present. Okay. Any questions or comments on suffering and the belief in God? Anything I didn't address that you have questions about?
I had a lot of trouble when 9/11 happened.
Is it?
Yeah, so I just wondered if you want to make any comment about that.
Okay, so as I understand it, Mary Ann, and this may not be the whole story, but as I understand it, the guys who commandeered those airplanes, they got into the U.S. on some kind of visa. I don't know what it was. But they did get a legal visa.
Yeah, educational, I think it was, or something.
And then they went to flight training school, and they told their flight training people that all they wanted to do was learn how to take off. They didn't want to learn how to land a plane. All they wanted to do is learn how to take off. Now, why that didn't ring alarms, and why the CIA couldn't have figured out that there's something funny about this, I don't know.
I heard that somebody blew a whistle about that and it was ignored.
That's possible.
It is possible.
Yeah.
I think it was a failure of intelligence on that
Yeah,
part.
yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
Do you think God knew that that was going to happen?
Yes. I think God knows everything that's going on.
I do too. But then the question is,
Why
why
doesn't
did
he
He
stop it?
allow it to happen, and why make so many people suffer when He could have prevented it?
Okay. I will try to address that.
Yeah, and that was more in line with what I was struggling with at the time, yeah.
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 Yeah, okay. All right. Why doesn't God stop bad people before they do bad things? All right. Well, if God was... Okay, first of all, tell me how many sinners there are on this planet.
All of us.
Okay, thank you. If God was going to stop all bad things, including things like that guy who ran into that guy's car and injured somebody badly, or even, you hear about crime on BART all the time. Bad things happen all the time. If God was going to stop all that, he would be a puppeteer and we would be puppets. We would lose our freedom. And when you lose your freedom, you're no longer a creature created in the image of God. That's my answer to that question. So God values our freedom because he loves us. And he loves us as his children. And we can be his children only as people who can freely choose. Otherwise, why would Jesus command his disciples to love one another? He didn't force them to, right? Once they received the grace they needed to love their neighbor, that's what's expected.
Can I ask a question, Pastor?
Yes, Sharon.
Going back then to the story in creation and the creation of Adam and Eve and the garden and that whole story there. Does this all mean, when you piece it all together into one big puzzle, that God knew from the beginning that we probably were going to break his law? We were probably going to sin. And he had to prepare for that in advance. So he had Jesus in his back pocket, so to speak, getting ready for the day when he knew that we probably would give in to whatever. Am I on the right track there?
You're absolutely on the right track.
Okay.
A couple of weeks ago, I don't know if you remember, but I quoted 1 Peter, who said Christ was destined from before the foundations of the world to come, which means Christ was predestined to come before there was even a world to come to. Yeah. Yep. You see, Adam and Eve are portrayed in the garden before they eat the fruit. They aren't portrayed as redeemed human beings. They're portrayed as naive and without having fully developed into the kind of people God wants us to be and the kind of people we will be when he redeems creation. Because otherwise, why would they fall to the temptation of the serpent?
I also think about those trees. There were two trees in the garden, a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then the tree of life. And so they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So in my mind, that is the origin of our constantly judging one another and judging good and bad. And that's where we get into all these illnesses that affect us in one way or another that causes so much evil in our world.
Yeah.
That story, anyway, makes sense to me in that respect.
Yeah. Yeah, this idea of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the way I interpret that is that human beings have a tendency to have a particular set of assumptions and ideas and a worldview. And they think that is the correct one. And people who cross the line and don't believe the way they do are evil. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Yeah. That's why we can't get along politically. We're at each other's throats. You can't have a debate anymore without there being insults and name-calling. Okay.
I have another question.
Okay.
What do you say to a child when the child says, if God created heaven and earth, who created God? How do you answer that?
So the way I would answer that is that God always was.
Yes, what I do.
There never was a time when God wasn't, because God lives outside of time. God is eternal.
But little kids,
Well, sure. I mean, you know, they live in time. There's yesterday, there's today, there's tomorrow, but you know, God planted eternity in the human heart. That's what Ecclesiastes said. And what he means by that is that we can conceive of a forever. For example, do you ever get to the end if you're counting numbers? Is there a last number? There's not. There's not a last number. There's always another number. That's eternity. And I think that this is part of my sermon on Sunday, so you're getting a preview. I think that when we encounter something so magnificently beautiful as, for example, the Grand Tetons or or Glacier National Park or parts of Yellowstone or Lake Tahoe, all of these places, we're attracted to them because we know our home is in paradise. And we're seeing paradise reflected in those beautiful sights. We know intuitively that that's where we belong. That's why we want a perfect world. That's why we're arguing about suffering. It's not perfect, so God can't have created it. Because, you know, well, that's a reflection of the fact that we intuitively know we need to be redeemed. I think the Christian faith makes sense of so many things about life, that human beings are fallen, that we are attracted to beauty and truth, that we need to be part of a group where we're accepted and loved. All of these things are reflections of our need for what the Christian gospel says is God's will for us. Okay, the other most common argument, and I'll make this fast because I know Judy has to get going. The other most common argument made by new and old atheists is that God is a delusion in our minds. Okay? Why would we create a delusion in our minds? Well, because human beings, I see this every day on the freeway. People are by nature anxious. Why do you think that people are trying to, they'll even fight with each other to get one car ahead on the freeway? That's anxiety. That's what that is. They want to get to their destination and they aren't thinking clearly because getting one car ahead isn't going to get them there any faster. But we're driven by anxiety because our lives are vulnerable to so many dangers and disasters. Because we are so vulnerable and there are so many dangers, and we could find ourselves in some disastrous situation in 5 minutes. We're naturally fearful and anxious and we seek security and peace and comfort. So we create a heavenly Father who we somehow convince ourselves is watching over us, taking care of us, that we can trust, who will give us peace and comfort, and everything will be okay. That's the source of belief in God. That's the argument. Okay? It's a delusion. The argument was made in detail by Sigmund Freud in a book called The Future of an Illusion. He called religion an illusion, and he thought it had no future because science could not verify anything of the beliefs of the Christian faith or his own Jewish faith for that matter. But I think Freud was a little bit, what's the word when you forget everything? His own Jewish people,
Short-sighted.
yeah, could not possibly believe in God as a crutch because their belief in God caused their persecution for centuries. They not only didn't find comfort in their belief in God, they got persecution because of their belief in God. And the same was true of the early church. All of the disciples were martyred with the exception of John. He's the only one that wasn't. Okay? So, you can read the essay. There's more to it than that. My answer to people who think religion is a delusion because we're fearful and anxious and scared and we need a source of comfort and a crutch to make it through life, that actually is false and disprovable by simply pointing out that more people who believe in God suffered because of that belief than than found in it a crutch. What did Jesus say it would cost us to become his disciples? You have to deny yourselves and pick up your cross. That doesn't sound like a crutch to me. Okay? Okay, so you can get the rest in the essay. Next week, we're going to address the... we're going to be more positive next week. We're going to talk about how Christianity makes sense of the world. Okay? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.